Today I'm going over my top 10 favorite horror movies from the 1970s on 4K or Blu-ray. So let's rock this. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Fuzz. So I am a huge fan of horror films from the 1970s. I just love that era. To me, the 1970s was one of the best decades for the horror genre in general. Although the 80s are fairly close for me as well. But I'd suggest that the 1970s were the era in which the modern horror genre was born. Now, of course, we had guys like Mario Bava and Alfred Hitchcock before that, so they definitely were planting a lot of seeds there, right? With great films like Psycho and Blood and Black Lace, Black Sunday. But the 70s is where everything really started to come together. Some of our most beloved and influential horror films were released during this time. And I believe the films made during this time set a new standard for horror that would go on to define the genre for many, many years to come. We're still feeling the influence of all these great films even today. So today I'm going to be doing a rundown of my top 10 favorite horror films from the 1970s on physical media. Now that means they have to be on either Blu-ray or 4K to be on my list, right? I don't do DVDs, as I've said previously, so Blu-ray or 4K is the jam here, right? But before I get into my list, I want to give you a little bit of background about my personal history with the horror genre, because it's fairly brief. I was a late bloomer to this genre. I didn't get into the horror genre until just the last few years, and really just the last couple years with any kind of intensity. I was just never a big horror fan most of my adult life. I was into sci-fi and action films. I didn't have a lot of interest in horror. Now, sure, I had a few exceptions like Halloween and Dawn of the Dead. I've always liked John Carpenter films. I would occasionally watch a scary movie on Halloween or something, or go through phases where I might be into horror movies for a very short period of time, like a few weeks or something, right? And I'd watch a few horror movies. But for the most part, I just wasn't into horror that much, and I didn't really give it my attention most of the time. But something kind of shifted in me a few years ago. Something just kind of clicked, and my taste in movies just started to expand and evolve. I started to look at movies from a more technical perspective, for example, thinking about things like shot composition and camera angles and lighting, and especially practical effects. I love practical effects. I think I was watching a few documentaries or something and started to kind of see the behind the scenes of how these things work, like movies like The Thing and Halloween, the making of Halloween, making of The Thing, things like that. I'm not sure which documentaries it was I was watching, but over the course of about a year or two, I just kind of had this kind of rapid, sudden shift that was also very organic and felt very natural, like I was where I was supposed to be, like I was going down the path that I was always meant to go down. It just took me a while to find that path. Essentially, I learned to appreciate the horror genre as an art form, and that made all the difference for me. Once I started seeing the artistic value of what they were doing, the subtext, the social and political commentary underlying in some films, I started to understand what the directors of these films were doing way better than I ever had before. I ultimately ended up doing a total 180 and becoming a huge horror fan within a very short period of time. And it really opened the door to other types of cool films from the 70s, exploitation films and other types of genre films. So over the last couple years, I've been putting myself through sort of a crash course on all the essentials, all these great films from the 70s and 80s that I missed, just to try and bring myself up to speed as quickly as possible. I've still got quite a few gaps in my knowledge of this stuff, just due to the fact that there's only so much you can cram into a 2-year period, right? So please just bear with me. For those of you who are far more experienced with this genre than I am, there will be films that come up on this channel sometimes that I've never seen that some of you will be like, dude, what? You've never seen that? And just bear with me, okay? I'm trying to continue to get myself up to speed as much as possible, but man, it's kind of like drinking through a fire hose sometimes, right? There's just so much in this genre to explore, so many subgenres. I'd like to think I've done a fairly good job at arming myself of most of the essentials in the genre and expanding my horror vocabulary overall, but I still have a lot to learn. So just keep in mind as we go through this list that it is the perspective of someone who is still relatively new to the genre. Now, these rankings are going to be based not only on my own personal preference and attachment, although keep in mind, all of this is just my opinion. Your opinions may be totally different, and that's totally fine. But the rankings are also based on not just my personal preference for the film, but also at times, if there happens to be a really good 4K release or physical media presentation that I want to highlight, that might play into why it's on the list as well. While all of these titles are films that I do love, sometimes I might give a little extra weight to a title if there's a particularly good 4K presentation. I know a lot of you are new to 4K and you might be looking for some recommendations, so consider this as a means for that as well. Also, keep in mind my honorable mentions will be at the end of the list, not at the beginning. I like to put them way at the end, and it's just for any titles that I really wanted to talk about but couldn't quite fit on the list, right? So stay tuned for the honorable mentions after my top 10. All right, let's do this. So coming in at number 10, we have Mario Bava's A Bay of Blood from 1971. This was put out by Kino Lorber, and it's a great film. This film is considered by many horror fans to be the first slasher film. It came out a few years before Bob Clark's Black Christmas, and it's just a great film. It's got some iconic kills in it. One of them was even replicated in Friday the 13th Part 2, almost lifted exactly. So I think you can definitely make the case that this film has been a huge influence on the genre, and Mario Bava in general. Mario Bava was a giant and one of the biggest influences on the horror genre in general. So definitely check out this film if you haven't seen it. It is a classic, Bay of Blood at number 10. Coming in at number 9, we have the 1979 Tobe Hooper made-for-TV film, Salem's Lot, one of the best vampire films ever made, which it might be a little surprising for a made-for-TV movie, right? This was I believe, CBS miniseries when it first came out in 1979, but it is just dripping with great atmosphere. And it delivers the scares. It's a great film. Certainly one of my favorite vampire films ever made to date. So now I hear they're doing a remake a remake of this. I don't know much about it. I'm curious to see what they do with it, but this is going to be a hard one to beat. So yeah, Salem's Lot, number 9. Coming in at number 8, we have the great Dario Argento and Suspiria on 4K. This was released by Synapse Films, and they do just incredible work. I got to tell you something about this release, okay? I'm sorry about the ring light reflection there. This release looks ridiculously good. It is one of my favorite 4K discs in my entire collection. So if you don't have this on 4K, you definitely are missing out. The funny thing is, it's not even one of my favorite Argento films, but the restoration that Synapse Films did with this title was nothing short of stunning. As was common for Argento at the time, Suspiria has this kind of avant-garde look, really heavy use of saturated primary colors. It is just an incredibly striking film to watch. This is probably the single best restoration that Synapse Films has put out, and it is one of the key reference demo-worthy discs that I always recommend when people are looking for new horror recommendations on 4K. This is like one of the first ones that comes to mind. So if you haven't checked out this Synapse restoration of Suspiria, absolutely a must-own for any horror fan. And coming in at number 7, we have 1979's The Amityville Horror on 4K from Vinegar Syndrome. This is another one of these amazing releases that if you don't have it on 4K, I would strongly recommend it. Vinegar Syndrome just absolutely knocked it out of the park with this restoration. To give you an idea, prior to seeing this version, I probably hadn't seen this film for probably 20, 25 years. And the film that I remembered was very drab and dreary and had a muted color palette. I didn't remember the film really looking that great. When I popped this bad boy in, I was just blown away by how good this looked. I saw colors that I didn't even know existed in this film. There was so much depth and pop to the image, and the colors are just popping all over the place. It really blew my mind. And I was like, dang, I didn't know it could look this good. If we're talking just about restoration, not special features or packaging or anything like that, I actually think this was Vinegar Syndrome's single best release of the year last year, based purely on the restoration. It really is a reference quality, a demo-worthy release. So if you haven't picked this up yet, I would strongly suggest it. Coming in at number 6, I chose Brian De Palma's Carrie from 1976 on 4K. This is the Scream Factory Steelbook, and I loved the art on the Steelbook. It's great. But this is another great 4K release. It's great transfer, looks faithful to the film, looks the way it's supposed to. Again, lots of depth and pop to the image. I love how artful Brian De Palma's style is, his use of the split screen. He's a true artist, and all that comes through on this. So if you haven't checked out Carrie on 4K, another one I'd recommend. And by the way, while I'm on the topic of Carrie, there's another great De Palma film I'd recommend that if you haven't seen it, it's called The Fury, and it's from 1978. Arrow has a Blu-ray of it. I don't know if any other versions of it exist on Blu-ray, but if you haven't seen The Fury, it's got a similar telekinetic thing going on with it, somewhat similar to Carrie. So if you like Carrie, you're probably going to really like Brian De Palma's The Fury as well. So check it out. Now, before I get into the last few entries, I just want to take a second to suggest that if you're digging the content, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Also hit the notification bell so you can always be alerted when I'm posting new stuff that you're into. And please like the video as well. It really helps with the algorithm. Thanks so much for the support. I really appreciate it. All right, let's get into the top 5 now. And coming in at number 5 is the great Dario Argento again with Deep Red. This is from 1975, and this is the 4K release that came out from Arrow. And this one I like. You got the nice chunky 4K box set there. I love these Arrow limited edition collector's box sets. I try to get them wherever I can for titles that are important to me. But anyway, Deep Red, this beat out Suspiria, not so much because of the transfer, but just because I like the film a little bit more than Suspiria. This is one of my favorite Dario Argento films, at least as far as the 70s are concerned. What can I say about this? Arrow always does great work. This is another great transfer from them, so you can always feel confident that you're going to get a good product from Arrow, for those of you that don't have this one. But definitely one of my favorite Argento films, and one worth watching if you haven't seen it. So yeah, Deep Red at number 5 for me. At number 4, we have 1979's Phantasm, directed by Don Coscarelli, whom I love. I love his work. This is a great, great film, and it doesn't get as much love as some of the other big franchises do, but I am a huge fan of not just this film, but the entire franchise. There's a little something for everyone in this. It's horror, but it also kind of merges sci-fi and action and drama and horror and just kind of throws it all in together. I just love this film. So this was actually kind of a gateway to horror for me. It was one of the early films I watched as I was getting into the horror genre and falling in love with horror. So this is kind of an important film for me. It holds a special place in my heart. So yeah, Phantasm, number 4. At number 3, I have the mighty John Carpenter and Halloween. This is on 4K, of course, 1978. I love the Scream Factory release, the rigid hardbox that they did with all of these Halloween films, and I've got them all. But yeah, this is going back to the early days. This is one of those horror films that I actually have loved for many, many years. It was one of the exceptions when I wasn't really into horror in my earlier days. I mentioned earlier I was a late bloomer to horror, but not with this one. This one has always been with me, and I've always loved this film. So yeah, and what is there to say about it, right? I mean, there's not much you can really say. This is John Carpenter's Halloween, right? I mean, we all know what this is. So yeah, number 3, Halloween. And while we're on the subject of mighty directors, let's go to the number 2 choice, George Romero's Dawn of the Dead on 4K. This is a second sight release. I unfortunately missed out on that really big, super cool second sight box set, but I'm pretty happy to have this one as well. I mean, this one's no slouch either. It's a 4-disc, chunky hard box set. So they really, I'm glad they at least put this out for those of us who missed out on the bigger 7-disc release of this film. But yeah, Dawn of the Dead, 1978. This 4K restoration looks incredible, like pretty much every other 4K on this list. This is no exception. And again, it's one of those films where what can you really say about it? It's iconic. It's a classic. It's a must-own film on 4K for any horror fan. So yeah, Dawn of the Dead at number 2. And my number 1 is Ridley Scott's Alien from 1979 on 4K. This is another one that is frequently cited as a reference disc, a demo-worthy disc, and it is one of my favorite 4Ks. I mentioned earlier that I was a big fan of Suspiria. Overall, like in terms of 4K discs in my entire collection, this is another one that I frequently recommend to people who are just getting started with 4K. The restoration on this is just outstanding. There's so much great detail. Everything, the HDR on this looks amazing. You can see so much more in the shadows and the dark areas. I think you can make the case that this film set the standard for sci-fi horror. And it's debatable as whether it's ever been rivaled since. So if you don't have this in your collection, I would highly recommend it. It's one of those must-own titles as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I don't know what else. Again, what else can you say about a classic like Alien, right? It's one of the greats. Okay, and as promised, I want to get into a few honorable mentions here next. I didn't mention The Exorcist from 1973. So yeah, that must be mentioned. I actually don't own The Exorcist on Blu-ray yet. It's just one of those ones I never got around to picking up. And I hear the 4K release is supposed to be coming sometime this year. I've been holding off on buying it, just knowing that the 4K release is just right around the corner. So I hope to add that to my collection soon. But yeah, The Exorcist is absolute classic. And if there were a 4K release of it out, it might have actually made my top 10 list. So it's only not on my list because I don't have a 4K release of it yet. So along the same lines, we also have The Omen, right? What year was this? 1976? Yeah. So Omen, another great one. It's all for you, Damien, right? So, and I won't say much about that. Another classic. I don't want to spend too much time on these honorable mentions, but it's a great one. And actually, I really like the whole trilogy. It's all good. But the first one is a classic like The Exorcist. So another classic here on 4K, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Great film. Donald Sutherland with Leonard Nimoy and Jeff Goldblum as well. Just a great film and a great 4K release from Kino Lorber. So check it out. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention Jaws, right? I mean, it's another classic, the first summer blockbuster. I've never been as huge of a fan of this film as others are, but I do like it. And just because of its iconic status, I had to include it in the honorable mentions. It didn't make my personal list, but I still enjoy the film, and it's still something we got to mention. Oh, and the 4K is, again, this is one of those that is frequently cited as one of those great 4K discs. So if you don't have Jaws on 4K yet, you definitely got to check it out. The transfer and restoration is just awesome on this. Okay, and one more release that I want to talk about here, just briefly as an honorable mention, and that is I Spit on Your Grave. I mean, this is a hardcore film. This one kind of surprised me. I didn't expect the film to look anywhere near as good as it actually does. They really did a good job. Now, this is from a boutique called Ronin Flicks, I believe. Yeah, Ronin Flicks. And so I wasn't familiar with them before buying this, but it's a really good release. It has some great special features, feature-length making of documentary in this as well. Really, the 4K restoration on this is just incredible. I couldn't believe how good this film actually looked. It's a rape revenge film, brutal and hardcore, but in terms of 4K releases, they did a really good job with the restoration of this film, and took me by surprise. So check it out if you're interested in this one. So that about wraps it up for my top 10 favorite 70s horror films on physical media. along with some honorable mentions. I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe got a few recommendations there to check out and pursue yourself. I also want to say a quick thank you to all my new subscribers out there. I'm just humbled and blown away by the support you've shown. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you soon.